Hello everyone, this will be the 13th chapter of Regular Boy Daniel Wayne, written by Diamond Rosie and read by Insect Overlord. This chapter is titled, Chill Out, Danny. Danny's parents' flight was on a Friday night, and Danny was leaving early Friday morning. Naturally, the house was in exceeding levels of chaos. Packing had felt so surreal to Danny. He had lived in a midi as long as he could remember, and had to fit it all into a suitcase and a book bag, ready to be shipped off to some house that Dick couldn't even give him a room count of. His friends had all come by at their own times throughout the week to help him pack. They did the opposite of help, but Danny still cherished their company. They were probably the hardest to leave behind, especially after everything they'd been through together. With innumerable promises to call and text and video chat and photos and Doom sessions, and visits over break and always keep them updated, Izuku was buckled into the back of Bruce's car as they drove off to the airport. Danny had gone to his parents to wish them a safe trip before they left, but they had, of course, sweetie, unattentive, and be a dear and pass me that device, honeyed their way out of the conversation. Dick had been the one to help him get everything into the trunk of the car. Their drive to the airport wasn't noteworthy. Danny had been to the Chicago airport a few times with Vlad, so he figured he'd know his way around. Fortunately for Danny, the airport was outside of the city, and most of the highways took you around the city to avoid traffic. The unpleasant memories that were threatening to erupt had nothing to latch onto. Dick watched Bruce take the exit to the airport, merging smoothly into traffic. Danny spotted the domestic departures before the car had approached it. Danny waited for Bruce to make the turn into that exit. Any second now. Danny gripped at his seatbelt. Bruce didn't take the turn. He didn't take the next one that allowed them to U-turn either. Danny's mind raced at the possibilities, anxiety gripping at him. Was Bruce sending him to some new kind of detainment center? Wait, did that mean Bruce knew he was Phantom? Bruce had never met Phantom before. He had tried, sure, but Danny had shut it down almost immediately. But Dick had met Phantom that one time. Had he somehow strung everything together and told Bruce? Dick was on his phone, Danny noticed. He could see the screen with a little bit of maneuvering. If he knew what they were planning, he could counter accordingly. Dick, we're almost on the plane. Dick, we secured the package. Dick, remember, no capes. Dick, I'm looking at you, Duke. Danny's hands latched to the strap of the carry-on bag, ready to run the second either of them made a move. What did he mean by package? Was he referring to Danny? Probably. They were going to ship him off like a package? Bruce finally making the turn caught Danny's attention. Every nerve in his body was taut, ready to spring into action as the car slowed to a smooth stop. Bruce stepped out of the car with no urgency. Danny wanted to believe that Bruce wouldn't do anything to hurt him on purpose, but he had thought that about his parents before, too. What if it was all an act, and Danny had played the fool the whole time? Again. There were people in coordinated uniforms walking around the car in a practiced organization. Danny held his breath. Bruce was talking to one of the people whose uniform stood out among the others. The person in charge, likely. Bruce turned to Danny between the exchange and smiled at him. Dick, who was still in the passenger seat when he turned to Danny, gestured with his head towards something on the other side of the car. That's one of ours, he said. Danny stepped out of the car and examined his surroundings. They were in a meadow of concrete, a large building Danny knew to be the Chicago airport a long distance away. The site of the whole building was blocked off by a sleek black and gold plane. It was slightly smaller than the other commercial planes a safe distance away. The gold embossed W on the tail was explanation enough why it stood alone. Maybe Bruce and Dick weren't trying to kidnap and experiment on him, Danny considered. And maybe Vlad really wasn't as rich as he said he was. The jet, just from the outside, looked magnificent. Danny eyed the propulsion system with interest. It revved rhythmically, waiting for its passengers to board. If you stare at them like that, I think the plane might just take off without us, Dick joked, noticing where Danny's interest had landed. Embarrassed, Danny peeled his eyes away and followed behind Dick to the entrance of the jet, only to find the embellishment on the outside were only a teaser for what was inside. a leather sofa on the far side of the plane, and dimmed lights around the top and bottom rims of the carrier cart. There were, apart from a large couch, 3 tabled areas that could seat 4 people each, 2 on each side of the table, with still enough room to walk comfortably in the middle aisle. Danny had barely taken in the sight when the air hostess greeted him. "Hello, Mr. Fenton. I'm Mia Matthews. It's a pleasure to meet you and an honor to be able to contribute to your first flight with us. Your father has already informed us of the circumstances of your arrival to Wayne Manor, and we will be preparing accordingly." "The circumstances of his arrival?" "During the flight, if there is anything you require, do not hesitate to ask any of the crew members, and we will provide for you to the height of our abilities." Miss Matthews smiled at Danny with a primed perfection he didn't know was capable of anyone. "Thank you, Miss Matthews." Danny smiled back politely, hoping it wasn't too stiff or awkward. The hostess blinked in surprise before she spoke again. "Would you like a tour of our amenities before the flight?" After he finally got settled in his seat, Danny thought of the text he had spied on between Dick and, he assumed, the others at the Manor. If Dick was Nightwing and Bruce was Batman, did that mean the others they were usually seen with are different members of the Bat Brigade? Pulling out his phone, Danny did a few cross searches in a secured tab. If his theory was correct, that meant that Tim Drake was probably Red Robin, and Damian Wayne was probably Robin the Current, since age and general build seemed to align the best. That was 4 out of however many of them there were. 4 that Danny was about to be living with. Processing that, Danny wondered exactly how he was meant to act on that information. By the sound of Dick's texts, Danny wasn't supposed to know. They would all probably try to keep it a secret from him. Danny supposed he could play along until they decided to tell him. After all, he had access to public and not-so-public information about them, so they deserved to at least get a read on him before he loaded that piece of knowledge over their shoulders. Besides, it would probably be fun to mess with them. Based on what Dick said about them, Danny hoped they could get along. He missed Jazz and Ellie. "Don't we need to get our bags?" Danny asked as they walked off the plane with nothing but what they had brought on with them. And by them, Danny meant just him. Half the flight in, Danny realized that Bruce nor Dick had brought anything more than what they could fit in their pockets. Though, having experienced the flight, Danny could understand why. Bruce brushed him off easily, as a sleek black car with tinted windows slowed to a stop in front of them. "Alfred will take care of it." "Who's Alfred?" Danny asked curiously, already having heard the name thrown around in conversation. "That would be me." The door to the driver's seat opened to reveal a gray-haired man in a pristine suit. If the flight staff were perfectly put together, this man was the one who had put them together to begin with. "You must be young Master Daniel. It's a pleasure to finally meet you," the man, Alfred, said, his words doused in a thick British accent. "This is Alfred Pennyworth, the family butler." Dick introduced the man in front of him. "It's nice to meet you as well, Mr. Pennyworth." Danny returned the greeting with a smile, feeling a little embarrassed about the title he had been assigned. "You can just call me Danny." "Alfred will do just fine, young Master Danny," he retorted cheekily as he walked and paced towards where the luggage had been boarded earlier, before Danny could retaliate again. "Pick your battles, Danny. This isn't one you can win," Bruce chuckled lightly, stepping towards the car. Danny turned around to watch Alfred almost effortlessly load the bags into the car, and couldn't help but be impressed. Slipping into the seat next to Dick, Danny leaned in to whisper, "Do you think Alfred is secretly Batman?" he asked, eyeing the ease he seemed to carry the last bags to the car. Dick eyed the man curiously from next to Danny as he walked back to the driver's seat. "Maybe we should look more into that, Bruce," he said in a serious voice, humor twirling in his eyes. "I'll write it on the to-do list," Bruce said dryly, a small smile threatening at his lips. Between the Fenton kids, one couldn't keep a secret to save a life, and one died keeping one. Or, well, Danny wasn't technically a Fenton anymore, was he? Regardless, it was clear they had no idea he knew. Messing with them was going to be so much fun. "I do hope you 3 are not conspiring back there," Alfred huffed as he buckled his seatbelt. "We wouldn't dream of it, Alfred," Dick said sagely, giving Danny a dramatic wink. Danny laughed silently to himself as he turned to memorize the drive to their destination. The city's skyscraping buildings faded into the clouds behind them as the stretches of primed grass and blacksmith gates increased. All of the uniquely designed yet equally extravagant entryways passed before the car took into its pick. Large black ribbon gates opened with the grandness Vlad only dreamed of, and a signature W woven into it. A gold plate on one of the pillars holding the gate read Wayne. Inside the gate's territory, the car drove down a smooth road surrounded by primed flower bushes and lakes. The trees seemed perfectly positioned, and the colorful fruits and flowers it bore seemed expensive. Eventually, they approached a mansion that fit the grandness of the gates as the car slowed. The feeling of having walked into a movie scene was only settled in more when the car came to a smooth stop perfectly in front of the short series of stairs that led to a building that was definitely some historic architect's masterpiece. Trying to act as normal as he could, Danny reached for the car door before it seemed to open on its own. Alfred stood perfectly by the door. "After you, young master." Maybe Danny should have worn a ball gown to finish the Disney princess feeling. Just one step at a time, dude. Not like this is the craziest moment of your life, month. Craziest moment of the month, so far. "Oh my gosh, he's here!" Steph shrilled, dragging Cass into the living room where they had all hunched on the floor, checking for hidden weapons like very normal people. Everyone jumped to their feet at the announcement, everything being set into motion. "Duke, where's your helmet?" Tim asked, going through his last-minute checklist. They had been preparing for this moment for the past few hours, but it still felt like there hadn't been enough time. "In the cave. I checked. Like 8 times, Duke said, pulling out his phone for a picture of his helmet next to the Bat computer, time-stamped for an hour ago. "We wouldn't want another incident," Steph joked. Cass nudged her at Duke's guilty expression. The clock was ticking. They were embarking on their most difficult mission yet. "Okay, Steph, take the 3rd corridor to the left. Cass, you take the right. Duke, 2nd hallway and chandeliers. I'll check the main hallway. Jason's not showing up till dinner 'cause he's at work." Tim emphasized their cover. "Check for weapons that aren't house-appropriate and any leftover equipment. T-4. Meet in the main hall. Go." They all scattered. Damien was holed up in his room since Alfred had left for the airport. They had already double-checked and triple-checked for weapons and non-civilian equipment, yet Tim still managed to find an unidentified cowl under the couch, 2 batarangs near the shoe rack, and a grapple gun on the coat hanger. Steph was the last to join back up in their meeting spot, but just in time to hear Dick chattering away animatedly a few feet away from the stairs. He laughed at something louder than normal. The door unlocks and Alfred steps through. "You all seem quite excited," Alfred commented, a slight edge in his tone. Alfred hung his jacket on the rack and migrated further down the hallway. "Ta-da!" Dick widened the door in a sing-song voice and displayed jazz hands for their newest arrival. "Okay, Tim, make sure you assert yourself. Do not make this another Damien situation." This kid was a civilian, so if he did jump him or something, Tim couldn't fight back like he'd been trained to. But he wasn't not going to need to fight back, because he would make himself so hardcore, the new kid wouldn't even think about it. Be hardcore, Tim. Dick sidestepped the door, revealing the notably shorter boy behind him. The kid's deep blue-gray eyes took in his surroundings and categorized it. This wasn't very civilian of him, Tim considered. He was Talia's son, even if he wasn't raised by one. Some things just had to be genetic. "Okay, Tim, now or never." The others seemed to have had the exact same idea, and there was an ill-timed chorus of "Hey!" in the entryway. The kid flinched back so hard, he jumped into Bruce behind him. Even Dick looked alarmed from the side of the door. "Sorry," they all said, at the same time again. Dick and Bruce gave them a wary look. Maybe teamwork did not always make the dream work. The kid looked around the room, part horrified and part confused. At least Tim had intimidated him, like he'd planned. Tim cleared his throat lightly, as a signal for the others behind him. He stepped closer to the other kids slowly. "Sorry about them," he jabbed lightheartedly. Steph and Duke huffed in indignation. I'm Tim Drake. Nice to meet you. Danny, he hesitated, looking at the people in the room. He steeled himself. Was this kid really Damien's biological brother? Hi, I'm Danny, he said more confidently, smiling easily at Tim. Whatever restraints the others had put on themselves crumbled as they all rushed out to greet him like a pack of golden retrievers. This is not what I meant by a warm welcome, guys, Dick chided lightheartedly from the side. Alfred had taken all of Danny's things to the room he'll be staying at for the time being. Tim had been asked to help him find his way, while Alfred headed to the kitchen. Steph, Cass, and Duke had also been given tasks to complete, so Danny was left to follow the black-haired, blue-eyed teen up the grand staircase and down the hallway. Here we are, Tim announced as he opened one of the many identical doors in the hallway Danny couldn't see the end of. The room was double the size of Danny's entire first floor, with ceiling-to-floor windows staggering on the wall, with delicately carved furniture placed at calculated positions throughout the room. The large Turkish carpet depressed under Tim's feet as he walked around and showed Danny the fully stocked bathroom, the size of a 3-bedroom apartment, the closet larger than his bedroom, and the TV that faded into the wall when not in use, and 100 other things Danny didn't even know existed. After the tour, Tim turned to Danny in a way that Danny knew meant he was trying to get a read on him. Red Robin, probably, watched him carefully. "How old are you?" he asked Danny curiously. 16, Danny answered. "What about you?" 16, Tim nodded. "When's your birthday?" He peered at Danny as if he could foresee his answer if he focused hard enough. February 12th, Danny smirked, instantly knowing he'd won by the look in Tim's eyes. "When's yours?" July 19th, he sighed, shoulders hunching in defeat. "Ha!" Danny laughed victoriously. "I'm older than you." 5 months isn't that bad, Tim retorted pathetically. Danny nodded sarcastically. "Sure, kid." Tim gasped in mock offense, turning away from Danny dramatically. "What do you think Alfred meant by 'for now'?" Danny asked after a moment, and looked around the room. "Bruce didn't tell you?" Tim asked, surprised. "Alfred was talking about how we each get to design our own room, and you just have to stay in the guest until the reconstruction is done." Tim explained easily, as if that wasn't the most rich person thing Danny had heard all day. It wasn't. When Danny didn't say anything for a while, Tim added, "You don't have to, of course. Damien never changed his room all that much. Dick and I were definitely the ones who altered our rooms the most." Tim hesitated for a second. "You can come by and take a look after you unpack, if you want." Danny nodded, wondering what exactly reconstructing a room looked like. "Sure." Tim seemed nice. It was impossible not to notice the difference between the suburban kid and the "sorry, this room is small, I promise the actual one is way bigger" kid. But in spite of that, he and Danny seemed to almost click instantly. Tim asked a lot of questions all the time. Not that Danny minded very much, since he was asking just as many. They talked about everything that came to their mind while Danny unpacked. They had made decent progress, and everything was going smoothly, until Tim spotted Danny's sketchbook. "Oh, what's that?" he asked, picking it up. Danny had made sure not to bring any Fenton tech that he could manage to survive without. A wrist ray and 2 thermoses were stashed in his toiletries bag he tossed under a bathroom sink earlier, but his sketchbook had been much harder to part with. His collection of prototype sketches, some more technologically realistic than others. Fortunately, not all of them were ghost-related. In fact, most weren't. Though, at that moment, the ghosts weren't his concern. Danny gulped silently. Tucker and Adam had been the only ones he'd ever shown his designs to, and they had always been super supportive. But Tucker and Adam weren't the world-class prodigy rising in the tech field, and Danny actually realized that regardless if this guy was Red Robin or not, he was still Timothy Drake Wayne. "Oh, that's, Danny hesitated, scratching at the back of his neck. Tim caught Danny's nerves instantly. "It's cool, I don't want to pry." He put the book down, curious eyes not leaving it. He totally wanted to pry. "It's not a big deal, Danny. Sure, Tim could come up with the designs in his sleep, probably, but, no pressure. It's just some random stuff I came up with. You probably wouldn't care too much about it. Tim tried to offhand, busying his hands in the threaded count of the silk pillowcase. If Tim hadn't been interested before, he sure was now. Really? He asked. Like what? Come on, Danny. He's literally 5 months younger than you. That's like half a year, so basically 1 year. Danny wasn't going to be intimidated by someone a whole year younger than him. You can look at it if you want, Danny shrugged. Totally cool. Totally unbothered. Tim took the sketchbook, not giving Danny a second to reconsider before eagerly flipping to the first page. He eyed the design critically. Danny hadn't even felt so vulnerable when he duked it out with Dan. Tim flipped to the next page. Danny could hear his pulse in his neck. At least he was breathing. Next page. Did Tim decide to go mute in the last minute? Do you think carbon fiber would be the best option for this? Tim asked inquisitively, showing Danny the design he was looking at. Danny cringed at the sight. That's from like 2 years ago, he explained, flipping somewhere towards the last few pages. I redesigned it a few months ago. Carbon fiber would be fine. Danny pointed at the device, and Tim nodded at the explanation. But lithium titanium would be a better option if you consider the conductivity. Tim considered the idea. If we go with that, we would have to fully remove this portion of the design and focus more on the... Bruce walked the hallway to the room Alfred had told him Danny was staying in for the time being. Bruce gathered himself as he knocked on the door to the room. He waited. No response. He knocked again, louder. What? Tim answered from the other side of the door, sounding preoccupied. Concern and curiosity opened the door to find Danny and Tim poring themselves over what looked like a sketchbook, murmuring back and forth to each other in conspiratorial voices. Bruce cleared his throat to get their attention. Tim looked up at him. What? He snapped again, irritated. Danny blinked at him. It's time for dinner, Bruce explained. It's barely 2, Danny commented, checking the clock on the wall. He blinked in shock to find that it was actually 7:30. Not commenting on that, Bruce continued. The others were pretty excited to meet you. Others? Danny asked. I thought I already met everyone. Not really. There's Barbara and Jason. You met Duke, Steph, and Cass earlier, Tim explained to Danny. Damien will probably show up too. The two started walking towards the dining hall. Bruce left completely forgotten behind them. The man couldn't help but chuckle to himself. One of his sons couldn't stand Tim, and the other one already seemed inseparable. Danny had been too preoccupied in his conversation with Tim to notice the slight shift in the air as they got closer to the dining hall. Barbara's greeting and introduction had finally brought Danny back to the present enough to realize the central part of the manor was older than the hallway Danny was staying in. It wasn't the decor or build quality that gave it away, since they both seemingly blended into each other. Wayne Manor was a generational home. Danny had read that it was one of the oldest homes still standing in North America. And what came with generational homes? Generational ghosts. Danny felt a cold chill of his ghost sense creeping through his spine, the uncontrollable huff of frost threatening his lungs. The ghosts weren't strong enough to elicit a full response from Danny's ghost sense, so probably no gruesome murders, but their history with the manor gave them a strong anchor to stay. Dinner just got a lot more intense. Nice to meet you. Barbara smiled at Danny as they both made their way to the large entrance of the dining hall, Tim only a step behind them. The room was crowded with people, talking and joking around. Emotions were a magnet for ghosts. The chill crept around Danny's lungs. Look alive, Tim whispered to him. Danny was totally alive. What was Tim talking about? Ghosts? What ghosts? Danny didn't know anything about ghosts. When Danny finally looked over to Tim, ready to feign confusion, Tim gestured to the wall away from the table. There was a kid, 13 maybe, leaning snottily on the wall. His arms were crossed over his chest, and his forest green eyes locked on Danny. Danny made his way over, trying for approachable and open as he smiled at the boy. You must be Damien. I'm fully aware of who you are. The teen stood up from the wall. Damien's posture was already perfect, but he stretched his neck up, seemingly at the height difference between him and Danny. He huffed and stomped away after a split second of uncertainty, purposefully pushing Danny's outstretched hand as he did so. Danny watched Damien walk away, and noticed everyone in the room pretending not to be watching them. Huh, Tim remarked. That went a lot better than I expected. He nodded to himself, impressed, as they walked to their seats just in time for Alfred to bring out the remaining dishes to the overflowing table. What exactly had Tim expected to happen? Danny didn't have too much time to ponder that, as the chill began creeping up again. He cleared his throat quietly. The ghosts fluttered around the room, jumbling nonsense of their time, unnoticed by anyone else. Danny didn't look at them either. Different dishes lined the table perfectly sized to fit at least 10 people. 12 if you squeezed. At the head of the table was Bruce, who only watched everyone else. Dick sat at his left, Barbara next to him, then Steph, Cass, and Duke. On the other side, Damien sat to Bruce's right. There was an empty seat for Jason, according to Tim. Work must have run longer than he expected. Next to Jason's spot was Tim and Danny. Steph smiled at him energetically as he sat down. "So, what do you think of the Manor so far, Danny?" The chill gripped his intestines. Danny forced it down, hoping he could get through dinner. "It's really big." Duke snorted at that. "You have no idea." Steph and Tim's head snapped at him. "Because you haven't had the full tour yet," he added quickly. "We should totally do that, after dinner. Right, guys?" He looked to the others for support. "Definitely," Steph nodded. Cass watched him quietly from across the table. Maybe she was the one sending a chill down his spine and not the ghost sense. "Wow, I'm so hungry." Duke looked around at the food animatedly. "Do you like food, Danny?" He grimaced as soon as he heard his own words. "Yeah," Danny laughed. "Love food." Alfred came around to fill each of their glasses. Duke nodded. He opened his mouth to say something else. "Anyways," Steph cut in, "you play video games." Cass chuckled quietly as she took a bite of her food. Dinner was going pretty well. Everyone took turns asking Danny random questions in an effort to get to know him better. The ghost chill fluctuated from almost gone to threatening to explode throughout dinner, but Danny was pretty proud of how long he managed to keep it in check. Distantly, Danny heard the sound of a motorcycle engine. The chill crept up his spine again. "Don't go ghost. Don't go ghost." Danny reached for the glass of water next to him, hoping to use it to cover up the frosty breath. The motorcycle was getting closer. "Just drink the water, Danny." Danny could feel Cass's eyes following his every motion. "Stay casual, Danny." The engine was getting closer. The motorcycle engine cut off, and all Danny's efforts for the night crumbled. The chill broke through the barrier and into the open. The puff of icy breath in the comfortably warm room turned heads. All the conversations stopped. Danny could feel every eyeball looking at him. Danny wasn't sure if it was his nerves or a malfunctioning ghost power, but the sound of ice crystals shifting through the glass of water in his hands had not been subtle. Moments stretched into hours. Danny tried not to collapse into himself. Duke was the first to react, practically jumping across the table. Instinctively, Danny snatched his hands off the table, but that didn't deter Duke in the slightest. He grabbed the glass of once liquid water, holding it up in the air triumphantly like it was a trophy, a grin splitting his face. "Yes!" he hollered. "Finally!" "You're a meta," the previously silent Danny accused, eyebrows arched disbelievingly. "No," Danny answered too fast, rejecting the perfectly created cover. "Danny, it's all right," Bruce tried, freaked out by Danny freaking out. "It's way more than all right, dude," Duke intervened, no regard for the delicacy Bruce was groping for. Excitement washed off him in waves. "You're an ice meta?" he asked again, leaning as far as he could. This time, Danny's mind actually processed the words. Meta were more common than not a ghost but still kinda dead half-ghosts, and far more easily explained. Not trusting himself to speak, Danny nodded. "I'm a meta too," Duke confessed. Dick's head snapped at him, alarmed, but Duke continued undeterred. "It's kinda like light and shadow, but sometimes I can see the future," Duke said, pausing to think. Before he could continue, the one who had undoubtedly ignited Danny's ghost sense sauntered in. When the room continued to stay silent, Jason, presumably, gave an annoyed and confused look. "Am I interrupting?" he snapped. "Last I heard, I was supposed to be here under martial law." This concludes Chapter 13 of Regular Boy Daniel Wayne by Diamond Rosie. I hope you liked this one. I liked how, they think that he's a meta, and I'm excited to see where it ends up. I hope you guys are too. The next chapter should be up soon. Thank you so much for listening.